Well, welcome back. My next guest, wow, what an interesting gentleman we have with us today, and very appropriate to have him on this Christmas Eve. I am honored to have with us J. Warner Wallace, cold case homicide detective. Yes, and he's authored a book called Cold Case Christianity. Homicide detective investigates the claims of the gospel. Now, what makes this so interesting is J. Warner Wallace also for many years was an atheist, but now has become an apologist. And by the way, he is the founder of pleaseconvinceme.com, a blog. You may want to check that out, pleaseconvinceme.com. Jay, nice to have you. How you doing, my friend? Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you, too. It's so great to be here. Catching us in between events this season of speaking, usually you have about a 3-week window, which I can grow a goatee. So you happen to catch me without being clean-shaven. Sorry about that.
No. It looks great. In Oregon, that's this common wear.
Well, down here in Southern California, it's so hot. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think it's in the 70s today, but I still can put on the Santa goatee just for the holiday.
Okay, well, nice to see you. Merry Christmas to you. Fascinating work. Tell us, first of all, your life as an atheist.
Well, I was the kind of guy who was pretty skeptical and pretty evidential in my approach to things. After all, I had been a detective for years. I was 35 before I really took a serious look at the case for Christianity. And I was the kind of guy who would have been the person you would have struggled with if you were in a conversation, because I was an adamant vocal atheist for all those years. And my friends would try to talk to me about these things, but I was always disturbed by the fact that a lot of my friends who were in law enforcement were very evidential about everything else in their life, especially about the professional life. But when it came to the claims of Christianity, they seemed to have turned that set off. I would ask them simple questions, and they wouldn't be able to give me the kinds of responses I would expect if they were investigators. You know what I mean?
So what tweaked your interest? I mean, if you're that hard, why did you investigate it?
Well, I mean, originally I walked into a church, and I had never been in an evangelical church before. I'd never seen live worship. It struck me as all kind of very, very new, very interesting. But as I sat in that church, the pastor was able to intrigue me just enough on the person of Jesus. You know, that this guy was a smart guy, an ancient sage who maybe had some wise things to say about my life. Maybe I should pay attention to those things. And I was willing to entertain that as a notion, the same way you'd be interested, say, in the teaching of Buddha or Baha'u'llah or any other ancient sage. And so I first picked up a Bible, bought my first Pew Bible for $6. I didn't want to spend too much money on this, just to really look at the red letters, to see what is it that Jesus teaches. And of course, you have to go through the Gospels in order to do that. Right. And it was that search through the Gospels that led me to consider whether or not they were actually eyewitness claims about an event in the ancient past, and that's what got me started.
Did you investigate any other faiths besides Christianity?
Yeah, my family is pretty much made up of atheists, primarily, and of Mormons. And so I had a lot of LDS family, my stepbrothers and sisters. I have 6. They're all LDS. So I did look at some of that. In high school, I had a teacher, a sociology teacher, who was Baha'i. I was very interested in the writing of Baha'u'llah. So there were some other aspects, other paths I took. But when I really started to kind of do the investigation from the perspective of an eyewitness, because we have certain parameters for eyewitnesses to determine whether or not they're reliable, that's when I think a lot of my investigation continued to point back to the Gospels. And the more I investigated them, the more they seemed to contain these reliable eyewitness accounts.
Well, of which now your background as a detective, you're noted for visual presentations in the courtroom, so obviously somewhat revolutionary. So that probably is how you approached it, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the time I was, my background's kind of diverse. I had a background in a bachelor's degree in design and a master's degree in architecture before I ever became a police officer. So a lot of my approach to doing anything was visual. So I've got a collection of degrees I don't use. Okay, so for the most part, but yeah, that's really how I approached everything. And when I would do jury trials, cold case trials, I try to make them very visual because that's the kind of person I am. And so as I looked at the case for Christianity, I started to kind of pencil out the diagram out the ways in which it was either reliable or unreliable. And the more I did this, the more I realized that, wow, you know, if we had this kind of case with this kind of reliability on the part of witnesses, we would be very comfortable in a jury trial. So what is it really that's keeping me from making a decision for Christ? Is it really that there wasn't enough evidence, or was it really that I didn't want there to be enough evidence? And I think I fell in that second category, because once you look at the evidence for the reliability of the Gospels, I think it's pretty clear. We've got accounts we can trust that accurately record an event in the past about Jesus, the resurrection.
So is there pressure among atheists to defend their position, even though they may be curious about the other side? And the reason I asked that question, Jay, is I interviewed an atheist the other day, and it just seemed like he was stuck on being an atheist, even though he was having a hard time denying what Christians proclaim.
Yeah, I think part of it for me is that I felt that the attitude that you would have, if you don't have an evidential view of the things you determine are true, it's really about epistemology. How do we know what we know? And if you'd asked me, well, why do you believe this particular fact about the world is true? And I was to say to you, well, I don't know, but God confirmed it for me. You would be suspicious of my view on that. You would say, well, have you examined the history of that event? Have you examined? So for me, I had to come at it from the perspective of I didn't believe that Christians were very good at determining what is true based on the manner they went about doing it.
Wow.
So I think as an atheist, I would have said Christians are actually dangerous, because if they take that same view, the same approach they take with their faith, if they took that approach in trying to determine, for example, political issues, social issues, I wouldn't trust that kind of thinking. I'm an evidentialist. We got to make decisions based on the best inference from evidence rather than an emotional response to an experience we think we had. So that's why I think a lot of atheists are determined to try to convince Christians that they're wrong. They don't trust the way they come to truth claims. And for me, when I realized the history of Christianity was replete with a very intellectual history in which Jesus himself says, if you don't believe what I'm telling you, at least believe on the evidence of these miracles. And he spends 40 days with the disciples in Acts 1, giving them many more convincing proofs. What I love about Christianity is that God gives us enough evidence to know that it's true. And we simply have to take the time to examine the evidence. That's exactly where I wanted to be as an atheist, and that's exactly where I am today as a Christian.
All right, so you start with the Gospels, the red letter, the four Gospels. Was there one particular passage that began to lean you a little bit towards opening your heart to this?
Well, what was first kind of piqued my interest was that when you have an event in which more than one witness observes the event, right, and you go out and you interview those witnesses, there's always variation between the accounts. You never get two witnesses to agree completely on an observation. I've never had that in a case. But what I do see is that sometimes they'll unintentionally, accidentally fill in details that the other one leaves out. And so the first witness will talk to you and tell you something, and you'll think, how can that even be true? And then you'll talk to the next witness, and he'll make sense of what the first witness said. I started to see this unintentional eyewitness support between the gospel writers. And as I saw that, it said, I'm going to take some time to see, how do these accounts puzzle together? You know, why does Jesus ask Philip to go look for a place to have to feed all these 5,000? You know, we don't understand really why until you read all the accounts, and you'll see that people will insert details that explain what the other did not explain. And as I saw that, I said, wow, that is very common in true eyewitness accounts. So that began my investigation a little deeper. These are sometimes called the coincidences. These are divine coincidences in the Gospels. And they really are very compelling for me as I examine them as eyewitness accounts.
How did you handle the book of John?
Well, I started off by trying to ask the first question you ask of any eyewitness. Were you really there? And so for me, I had to know, were the Gospels written early enough to have actually been written by eyewitnesses? And for me, it all centers on Luke's work in the book of Acts. I think there's good reason to believe that the book of Acts is written before the martyrdom of James, the martyrdom of Paul, the martyrdom of Peter, and the destruction of the temple, because these things are all missing. And that puts that account before 61 AD, when James, the brother of Jesus, is martyred. Now, I think there's good reason to do that. I go into this in one chapter in the book. And then that means that the Gospel of Luke is actually dated earlier than that. I think there's some good internal evidence in Paul's writing to indicate that it's dated really into the 50s. And then that means that Mark's account is even earlier than Luke's, because Luke it quotes Mark more than anyone else. And Luke actually says that his account is an orderly account to Theophilus in the first chapter, when Papias in the first century says that Mark's account is not necessarily orderly. So it appears that Luke is using Mark as a primary source and telling Theophilus, I've got this stuff in the right order. So I think this is powerful for me as I looked at the evidence. I do believe that they're dated early enough, the Gospels, to have qualified in the very first category of eyewitnesses. They were actually present. Now, as far as John goes, I can tell you this. When you have eyewitnesses that come to you and give you an account, and then one comes a couple of weeks later, if that person a couple of weeks later is aware of the first accounts given to you, they will typically not give you the whole account. They'll just fill in the details they know were missing from the other accounts. I have to say, you know what, it's time out. Go back to the beginning. Give me all the details. John's account feels very much like a late eyewitness account that comes in after the eyewitness knows what's already been presented, and it fills in details. And that explains a lot of why I think it's focused in very narrow areas, filling in details, and doesn't go back and try to reiterate a lot of what's been said already by Mark, Matthew, and Luke.
Fascinating. Your first glance through, checking the evidence and the witnesses, did you see any conflict?
Well, of course, you always see what I would call apparent contradictions, but that is not unusual. As a matter of fact, I expect that. Can you imagine if we had 4 Gospels that were word for word exactly the same? Do you think the skeptics in our world would be any more impressed with these? No, they would say that, no, come on, this is collusion. I can tell you, I had a homicide once where I didn't get there for an hour, and in the hour before I got there, the officers who were holding the witnesses put them all in the back of one police unit and let them sit there for an hour without any observation. We didn't monitor them, and sure enough, when I got there, they had talked to each other for the entire hour. No, I want the messy, apparent contradictions of competing eyewitness claims, because that is the hallmark of true eyewitness testimony. And when I see there's a certain range I expect, and I found that range in the Gospels. Nothing that contradicted, but certainly the things that came together, and together they make the most complete, robust account that I'm looking for. So I'm never disturbed by what might be apparent contradictions. I expect those when I have true eyewitness accounts.
Wow. All right, let me take a quick break here. Jay
Sure.
will come back. This is absolutely fascinating. By the way, the book is entitled A Cold Case Christianity, and you may want to check this out. The foreword is by Lee Strobel, and of course, you know a lot about him. It's put out by David Cook Publishing, and davidcook.com. You may want to check it out at the Christian bookstores, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And when we come back, we have some more questions about his investigation of Christianity. We'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and my special guest today is J. Warner Wallace. He's the author of a book called Cold Case Christianity, formerly a homicide detective, investigates the claims of the gospel. The picture of the book there on the screen. Let me encourage you, this is done right. An atheist turned Christian apologist, and a fascinating story to say the least. And as we traffic through this, Jay, it's just fascinating, because I think what you helped us do here, and part of something I want you to continue to unpack, is that Christians weren't convincing to you. And I think we have got to get this thing down. We're missing opportunity here. Most of the world knows what we're against. They don't know what we're for, and we can't defend it properly. And you certainly show us how to look at this from a much more strategic point of view. Just one other quick question personally. At what point, what happened, do you realize that Christ was who he said he was?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between belief that and belief in. I mean, I got to a point where I believed that the Gospels were telling me the truth about Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay.
But I wasn't at a place where I was trusting him for my salvation. As a matter of fact, even though I believed that the Gospels were reliable, I still didn't understand the gospel message, because I was a very new investigator. I mean, I didn't have a background in the church or a background with Christians who could help me out. I remember talking to my wife one night and saying, hey, I think these are reliable accounts, but I don't understand what the cross is all about. Why even have to die on that cross? What's the gospel? I don't get the whole gospel. Do you understand it? And she says, no, I don't really understand it either. Well, okay. I had to do another search to discover what the gospel was about. And here's how I typically put it. I think that as you search evidentially for the person of Jesus, in the Gospels, you will form belief that. But to get to belief in, you have to look for yourself in the New Testament. And as I looked for myself in the New Testament and realized my need for a Savior, realized that that man being described by Paul in Romans and in 1 Corinthians was me. I mean, I recognize myself in those descriptions of Paul. Paul describes the need we have for a Savior. And as I read through those, I realized, wow, I have a need for what it is Jesus actually did on that cross. And that's when you move from belief that to belief in. It's one thing to have intellectual assent that this is true. It's another thing to trust it with your life, to trust it for your salvation. And I think you get to that place as you examine what the Gospels and what the New Testament says about each of us rather than just what it says about Jesus. And that's where I think I made that transition. I had to have, but here's the difference. For me, I have a lot of friends who would say they trust in a truth claim without knowing if it's evidentially true or not. I have 6 brothers and sisters raised in the Mormon church. And they would say that they trust in this, but they haven't gone through the important step of belief that. They jumped right to belief in without first traveling through belief that. And if you're not careful, you can believe any number of things that may not be true because you haven't taken the important step. Now, the great thing about taking that important step is that that gives you the ability then to defend what you believe later on when someone asks you, because that's the path you took in. You now can retrace it for people. And that's really all I'm doing in Cold Case Christianity. I'm showing you how I came from zero to believe that, to belief in, by examining all of this. And now I'm able to go back and defend what it is I believe, because I didn't just jump in emotionally. I didn't jump in because my parents were believers or because I had friends. I jumped in because I did an evidential investigation that led me to this truth. And that's why I'm here today. Not because it works for me, not because it's always even comfortable. It's always even, makes my life easier. It doesn't always make my life easier. Sometimes it's harder to be a Christian than it is to be a non-Christian. But I'm a Christian because it's evidentially true. And that's, I think, a much better place for us to be, regardless of whether that day is going well for you today, whether your life is great today because you're a Christian. You happen to live in the truth, and that's the most important place you can possibly be.
Wow. That's powerful. So how's that played out in your family now?
Well, it was interesting because I didn't have anybody. My wife and I were together for 18 years before I became a Christian. And I don't think we saw the transformation, could anticipate the transformation. And so I think it probably took all of us a little bit on our heels. It takes a period of time to transition. It's been now 17 years. So I'm actually, I think, in a place where I'm able to kind of share what I've learned. But I didn't do it for a long time, because it takes time, I think, to transition to a new life. And probably, I think it's wise for us not to trust too quickly in somebody who's just made that quick transition. But I feel like I'm in a place now where I can share what I've learned to help people make a step, to not just be what I call a one-decision Christian. You decided to trust Christ for your salvation. But 1 Peter 3, what does Peter tell us? All of us have to be ready to give a reason for the hope we have. That's the second decision. Decide to defend what you believe. And we are definitely in a culture right now that we need to take that second step, because most of our young people, for example, in their college years, the number of young people who leave the faith, that leave the church, even for a season, only about a third, Lifeway says, ever even come back to the church. We've got to do something about that terrible dilemma. And we can begin by giving them good reasons to stay, rather than listen to what their professors maybe are telling them, what the culture is telling them, and leaving the church, to really chase what is, in fact, a lie, when they had the truth to begin with.
Fascinating. How would you defend Jesus against the pluralistic mindset that's out there, that we all in the end believe in the same God and all roads lead to heaven? I mean, you know the drill.
Absolutely. And the problem, of course, is that would be fine if all of the claims were the same. That what we have instead, though, are claims about God which are directly contradictory. So that means that we can both be wrong, or one of us can be right, but we both can't be right because we have contradictory claims. If my Jewish friends would say that Jesus might be a wise rabbi, but he certainly isn't the Son of God, he certainly isn't God himself, that's a competing claim. We can both be wrong, or one of us can be right, but we both can't be right. My Muslim friends would say that Jesus never even died on that cross. We would say he died and rose from the dead. We can both be wrong, or one of us can be right, but we can't both be right. So when you have competing claims like this, it's important for us. It's like you have two suspects in a murder. I've got to make sure one of them may be the killer, or none of them may be the killer. But if they're in two different places and they got two different competing claims, they both can't be the killer. And so it's time for us to search out and see which suspect is the most reasonable inference from the evidence? Which claim about God is the most reasonable claim from the evidence?
All right, defending Christianity in today's culture is really a task because we don't like the exclusivity that the gospel suggests, and we're seeing that even today with the Duck Dynasty controversy. I mean, he just quoted scripture. I mean, you know that whole story.
Right.
So Christianity is under attack, especially when Jesus says in John chapter 14, "I'm the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father but through me." I mean, that is the one verse that puts everybody at tilt.
Yeah, the exclusivity is an issue. I think we redefine tolerance in our culture. Tolerance today simply means that all of us must agree and give the same value to every competing claim. No claim is more meritorious or more true than another. We've got to embrace every claim as though it's equally true. That's the new definition of tolerance. But that definition can't even stand on its own feet, because if we said, well, you know, we don't think every claim is true, will you accept that claim as true? No, they won't. If we say we think there are some claims that are right and some claims that are wrong, some things that are true, some things that are not, some things that are good, some things that are bad, will you accept our position on that? Well, no, they won't. So you see, they can't even be tolerant based on their own definition of tolerance. I quickly say it like this. Tolerance requires 3 Ds, the 3 Ds. First of all, it requires a disagreement. If I don't disagree with you, there's no reason to tolerate you. We agree. So you have to have the first D, disagreement. You also have to have a distinction, the second D, between the two sides. We don't have to agree. We can be completely distinct in our views. But the third D is critical. We have to have a certain demeanor. I can't be a jerk because I disagree with you. And so that's the true definition of tolerance, is when we disagree about something and we have two distinct views, a differentiation, and we have a proper demeanor toward each other, that's when we have true tolerance. But the culture has kind of redefined what tolerance is, and that's really the dilemma we find ourselves. I sometimes will just start by kind of returning back to the traditional definition of tolerance to help people see where they've gone wrong on this.
All right, the few moments I have left, Jay, what would you say to the faith community that they need to re-examine how they're representing Christ? Because obviously you were turned off by it. And I see this as a growing issue, because at the same time, people are, well, here at the Dove Radio and TV, we're hearing 2 questions primarily. What is truth, and who can I trust? I mean, the fields are white unto harvest. This is our moment. And if we're not presenting Christ in a believable way, then what good are we?
This is what every jury asks. What is true about what happened in this case, and which witnesses can I trust who came to the stand to testify? And that's what we do as jurors in this world as well. We have to ask ourselves a question. What is true about the world around us? And how do we determine who we can trust on this issue? If we don't take an approach toward the Bible, toward the Gospels, which is really about being able to demonstrate the truth of what they say in a way that's powerful to the world around us, we're not going to be able to help the world answer those 2 questions. And those are 2 very, very powerful questions. So here's what I'm encouraging people to do. Look, we've been called to be more than cultural Christians, accidental Christians. We're called to be case makers. This is what Peter says in 1 Peter 3. He doesn't say some of you should be able to make a case for what you believe. He says that all of us have to be ready to give a reason for the hope. All of us. If you find yourself this morning, like, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm not sure I can defend the Bible. I'm not sure I can defend the deity of Christ or the resurrection. It's time to stop being a passive, accidental Christian and start to be a Christian case maker. That's what God has called us to do. And if you'll take that challenge, it takes some work, but boy, is it worth it, because your faith will also grow and you'll have an impact on the world around you like you never had before. That's my encouragement to everyone who's listening today, is to become a better Christian case maker.
All right, well, and here's the tool. It's right here. It's called Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. And let me encourage you to get a copy of it. There's a picture of it on the screen, put out by David Cook Publishing. You can go to davidcook.com, check it out at Evangel, Christian Discount Books, Barnes & Noble, online at Amazon. Get a copy of this. And what an incredible resource. Jay, you're an inspiration. You're a delight. Loved it. Love to have you back, and keep up the good work. And to you and yours and your family and your staff, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you guys, too. I really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, God bless. We'll be right back.